It is the 16th of October, and this day in Baptist history, our reading is the Baptist Father of Java. Our verse comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 14. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. Born in 1783, Gottlob Bruckner became an amazing Baptist missionary. I believe that the story of his life will be an inspiration to all who hear this account. Born in a farm family south of Berlin, Germany, Gottlob was raised in a Bible reading family where devotions were a part of the daily schedule. At age 20, the young man left home to seek his fortune, making his way to the city of Berlin. In the German capital, he met a preacher whose sermons brought him to serious consideration of God's requirements, and there he was genuinely converted. Gottlob became acquainted with the work of William Carey as the pastor shared reports of the work in India, and he began to think that God was calling him to be a missionary as well. It so happened that his pastor friend was conducting a missionary training school, and Gottlob enrolled. He studied there for 18 months and then was sent on to Holland for additional training. It was necessary to learn the Dutch language, but the young man disciplined himself, and his training continued there for 3 more years. In 1811, a mission society was formed in the Netherlands, but the political climate under Emperor Napoleon made it impossible to leave the country. Thus, Gottlob Bruckner was sent back to Germany for an additional year of study, and finally it was determined that Mr. Bruckner and 2 friends should be smuggled into Denmark, and from there to Sweden, that they might finally sail for England. And in England they would be sent out as Great Britain missionaries. Each man traveled with just one bundle, and in 2 months they finally arrived in England. But now another problem existed. They were unable to speak English. Thus another year of intensive training was needed. Accomplishing that goal, Gottlob Bruckner was ordained in England. The war was almost over, and Reverend Bruckner's trunks could now be sent to him, but the warehouse where they were stored caught fire and burned to the ground, with a total loss of all his earthly possession. Inasmuch as England had taken over Indonesia from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, it was decided that Reverend Bruckner and his 2 friends would be assigned there. They sailed on January 1, 1814. As they neared the equator, their ship was nearly sank in a massive storm. Finally, reaching South Africa, they found another vessel sailing to Indonesia. The 3 men landed in Jakarta, the capital, and Gottlob Bruckner went on alone to Semarang, a seaport on the north coast of Java. Twice his ship was attacked by pirates, and after going ashore, the missionary had to hike through a tiger-infested forest. In Semarang, Reverend Gottman became the pastor of a large stone church that had been built by the Dutch in the ancient past. The members were primarily Dutch and Indonesian families, but their worship was primarily an empty, and I quote, form of godliness, end of quote, without reality. Reverend Gottlob married the daughter of an elderly Dutch pastor, and in time 8 children were born to the family. With the tropical diseases and no modern-day drugs, 4 of the children died during infancy. While the missionary pastor was visiting other cities, a new missionary family arrived. Reverend and Mrs. Thomas Trout were Baptists from England. The 2 men became fast friends. Bruckner had learned the Malay or Indonesian tongue and was able to communicate in the language. As Tom Trout studied the language with Gottlob Bruckner, the 2 discussed baptism at length. Finally, Reverend Bruckner decided he must obey God, and thus on March 31, 1816, he announced to his people, and I quote, "I plan to be baptized. I now believe the Scriptures teach baptism by dipping after a person believes in Christ and not before." End of quote. The following Lord's Day, Reverend Trout immersed Reverend Bruckner, and the church people soon turned Reverend Bruckner out of his pulpit. Only 6 months later, Tom Trout died of a tropical fever, And because Indonesia had been given again to the Dutch, no new Baptist missionaries from England could enter the country. In fact, the new Dutch governor ruled that all English missionaries had to leave. But being German, Reverend Bruckner could remain. Tom Trout had started working on a translation of the New Testament into the Javanese language, and now Bruckner took up that task. Then one day he received a letter from William Carey inviting him to take his precious manuscript to India for review. William Ward, a printer, had been appointed by the British Mission Society on October 16, 1798. The missionary team with Dr. Carey had translated the Bible into many languages in the area, and now the great father of missions was interested in the Javanese New Testament. In 1828, accompanied by his two sons, Reverend Bruckner made the journey. Little did he know that he would be gone for 3 years, and that one of his sons would die of a tropical fever during that time. But the man of God persevered. The language was far different from others of the area, and Bruckner worked with the printers, explaining the strange-looking characters. When the task was completed, the missionary and his son boarded a ship with 2,000 Javanese testaments, 20,000 tracts, bundles of paper for printing, and a set of typefaces with Javanese letters. Their ship was almost sunk in a typhoon, but God heard their prayers. Arriving back home, Bruckner was faced with soldiers seizing all but a few of the testaments, but he would not quit. He printed tracts and finally sent a copy of the New Testament to the kings of Holland and Prussia. The result was changes in the Dutch colonial government in Indonesia, and religious freedom was again allowed. To the end of his life, Reverend Bruckner saw few direct results from his preaching. He died in 1857, and no Baptist could assist in the spreading of the gospel in Indonesia. But other Christians came to the field. Today, there are more professing believers in Java than in any other place on earth where Islam is the strong majority religion. A Baptist was used of the Lord to prepare the way. It is required of stewards that they be found faithful, and we honor the memory of Reverend Gottlob Bruckner, another unsung Baptist hero. To God be the glory.